like to say a couple words before I actually start in on the sermon I wrote. I know it will work written. I am not sure if I can deliver this the way it sounds in my head spoken, so we'll see. I felt moved to not just use my own voice, but to also speak for those who might be a little bit too embarrassed to be up here today. So I hope that through the parallelism that I used, fancy literary term, sorry about that, that you'll be able to hear their voices as well. Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy wearing a linen ephod. The young Jesus was in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking questions, and all who heard were amazed at his understanding and his answers. From my own youth, two statements stand out about the place of children and youth in the church. One, I remember from confirmation class. I was told the church is always one generation from dying out. The other, I heard many, many times over the course of several decades. Our children are the church of tomorrow. I am convinced that neither of these statements is entirely accurate. Children in the church today, like Samuel and Jesus, are likely to be faith leaders in the community of God's people in the future. But we cannot know that now. What we do know now is that our children are the church of today. Perseus is ministering before the Lord, a boy carrying a taper like the train of a great king as he enters a throne room. Throughout the history of the church, youth have served as acolytes, assisting clergy at the altar. Most frequently, they bring the light to the candles on the altar, which represent the presence of God, and carry it out again as the Lord leads his people into the world. The echoes of the work of Samuel, which is recorded in the verses that follow today's reading, in which he slept in the temple so that he could tend the lamp of the presence through the night, is their work today. Charlie is ministering before the Lord, a boy carefully preparing the elements for communion. And there are many other types of altar service that have been done by acolytes historically and may be done by them today, including preparation of the Lord's table and care of leftover communion elements, presentation and removal of any items used at the altar, presentation of water to the baptismal font, ringing of bells at particular times in special services, and generally any task for which the clergy and lay leaders need an extra pair of hands to assist with. As Samuel undoubtedly fetched and carried and cleaned and stood at the ready with what would be needed next, as the priest Eli led the Israelites in worship. Easton is ministering before the Lord, a boy bringing the offerings of the community of worshipers to the altar. While there is always some amount of formal training for acolytes, it's common in Christianity for acolytes to be preparatory members, new members, or those just beginning a ministry journey. As Christ calls the children to come to him, and for adults to come to God as a child, we encourage those who are young in faith to do this important work. What a beautiful reminder to the rest of us that whoever is last will be first, and the greatest among us is the servant of all. Sebastian is ministering before the Lord, a boy diligently ensuring that leftover communion elements are properly honored and cleaned up after. Like the young Jesus, our children also teach us. Out of the mouth of babes, as the psalmist and the author of Matthew indicate, you, God, have built a protective wall of praise. Anyone who has spoken with me at length has probably heard me assert that I consider the average 7-year-old to be a better theologian than most adults in our society, including many of those who have been in the church for decades. In this world, we train ourselves out of awe, teach ourselves not to see the vision that is not of this physical world or feel the texture of the spiritual world through the veil of the material. We are taught that it is rude to say what is true, and it is impertinent to ask uncomfortable questions. But it's not in praising God that the boy Jesus amazes the learned theologians in today's story. we are told that he was listening and asking questions. The young Johann is before the pulpit, talking about something he's interested in and connecting it to the topic of the children's message. And all who hear are amazed at the connections he draws and how it changes their understanding. As a few of you know, I've been in speech therapy for several months. When I've mentioned this, some have been startled. Generally, I don't come off as someone who struggles to express herself with words. However, one of the things I realized as I reevaluated my life after my neurodivergent diagnoses were confirmed is that I struggle to ask questions. I've been working to overcome a fear that questions will be seen as a challenge to power, dread at being ridiculed or seen as deliberately obtuse for not already knowing the answer, and a conviction that the person I was asking would not feel I was worth answering, led to a lack of skill at literally putting the words of my inquiries into the form of a question. And I was explicitly taught and encouraged to ask questions, especially theological questions, from a very young age, and to avoid the company of those who discouraged clarification and doubt. That is not a common experience in the church. The young Orion is sitting at the Wiggly worship table, chuckling sardonically and muttering that the thing the pastor just said isn't the way many Christians act. The supervising adult is amazed at his understanding and courage to speak the truth. I should specify that when I say the church, I do not necessarily mean Trinity-St James or even the United Methodist denomination, but the church universal, the whole community of believers of various flavors worldwide. I cannot count the number of times my age peers have told me something like, "I stopped going to church when I was 8. They said I asked too many questions." The age varies, along with how many questions it took for them to be disinvited. But the experience was apparently very common in the 80s and 90s. Instead of allowing themselves to be amazed at the depth of understanding, which challenged them to learn what they did not know or examine the logic of their explanations, there were apparently quite a few adults who chose to feel threatened or see disruption in curiosity about the connection between spiritual growth and church doctrine. The young Grace is in the pulpit, reading the scriptures and leading the congregation in gathering for worship. And all who hear are amazed at her love for the scriptures and joy in the liturgy, which is the work of the people. And following the boy Jesus' example in listening was often just as much a hindrance in young people's approach to Christ. In discussions recently, I have encountered statements like these. "I grew up going to Sunday school at a Methodist church. We learned manners really well. And we heard Bible stories. I was amazed several decades later to feel the love of Jesus and learn that God forgives. I kept hearing that God forgives all sins, but it seemed only the powerful men in that church were being forgiven, and the victims of their abuses were often driven out of the community in shame." I realized that most Christians have only a 5th grade religious education, which was taught to them by old ladies who also had never learned much beyond 5th grade Sunday school. I don't know where I will go now. That last one is from a retired pastor upon his congregation's decision to disaffiliate from the UMC. The young Tory is in the church building, working among the AV techs, learning how to work the cameras, and all who are worshiping are amazed at her eagerness to serve in a new role at the last minute. For several generations, church attendance was so common that it was just assumed children who grew up in the church would stay in the church. Those who were sent home from Sunday school would eventually repent and rejoin when they were ready to behave themselves. Instead of accommodating the developmental needs of children in corporate worship, they pulled them out into separate story and craft children's worship programs, which rarely taught them anything about what the adults were doing in worship. And sometimes they shuttled them into teen and young adult worship experiences that were basically stage shows. When those children and youth got into adult worship, many encountered a list of traditional hymns and prayers and creeds that were not only unfamiliar and archaically worded, but also had no spiritual meaning for them personally. I was fortunate enough to have 2 seminary graduates as parents who walked me through that transition, but most people did not. The young Maya is scampering up and down the aisle, beaming and babbling excitedly at each person in turn, and all who meet her are amazed at her joy and her confidence in the safety of her church community. See, you do not need me to tell you that our young people are the church of today, because they show it to you. Today, the children of Trinity-St James United Methodist Church are actively serving God and others within the safety of this community. What does that mean for us? For the church of today, but with a little bit more experience and agency in this world. What is our duty to our younger brothers and sisters in Christ? Like Hannah, we must clothe them, and not only in the literal sense. Throughout the Bible, clothing is used as a metaphor for the qualities of a person. As Samuel's ephods were lovingly crafted by his mother, our children's character traits will be shaped by our example. As we promise in the baptismal covenant, we must surround them with a community of love and forgiveness, that they may grow in their trust of God and be found faithful in their service to others. That comes from being able to trust us and seeing us serve. We must also be prepared, as Eli does a few verses after our Old Testament reading, to guide and encourage them when God speaks to them, even, perhaps especially, when God is speaking to them more clearly than he is speaking to us. We must teach them to listen with open hearts, and we must also listen receptively when God speaks through them. Like the teachers in the temple courtyard with the young Jesus, we must allow ourselves to be amazed at their understanding. But what if the message is that the church has been falling short? What if the message is that there will be no legacy of brick and mortar houses for congregations worshiping on Sunday mornings? What if the message means the end of our legacy? This also happens to Eli in the ensuing verses. He learns his legacy is about to be wiped out, and we must be ready to accept that message. But this brings us back to that thing I was told in confirmation class. Will the church die out? No. But she may look very, very different from what we have come to expect. I'm convinced Christ will not let his bride die, but he may delight in giving her an epic makeover. Like Mary and Joseph, we must facilitate opportunities for community for our children. We know Mary and Joseph had done this for Jesus because they traveled a full day before they noticed he wasn't with them. They had a group of people so safe that they could not notice for a day of travel where he was. We must provide safe spaces for our kids to be playful in and messy in. We must provide opportunities for our teens to explore ways to express their growing understanding of who they are, for our youth to try a variety of vocations, both inside and outside the church. Evelyn Underhill, an Anglican theologian, who described the human pursuit of spirituality as a biological imperative, and neurology backs this up, by the way, pointed out that as children become adolescents, they crave the guidance of adults other than their parents, and they crave the support of their peers. We must be ready to provide that guidance, and we must provide a space and a framework for the safety of supportive peer relationships. Also, like Mary and Joseph, we need to go searching for our children. That is, we need to discover who they are. We can shape their behavior with our example, but God has shaped their inner identity. And God is not known for adhering to the expectations of parents. Once I heard an Old Testament scholar say that the proverb, which is oft quoted, "Train up a child in the way he should go," would be more accurately rendered, "Train up a child in their own way." We can help our children discover what their own way is, but we cannot determine that way for them. The writer of the Gospel of Luke claims that Mary and Joseph looked for Jesus for 3 whole days without finding him. Why so long? Because they were looking for a 12-year-old, not that 12-year-old. It was obvious to Jesus that the temple courtyard was where he needed to be at that time for his ministry. In the community of the faithful worshiping God, he felt close to his Father. When we see the warm love of God shining through our children, we must recognize that in that moment, in that activity, that group, that place, they are drawing near to God in accordance with God's purpose for them. We must encourage them in that. Encourage them to seek that closeness. Like the teachers in the temple courtyard, our children will be listening and asking questions. Actually, this is the job of the entire church, listening and asking questions. That is, keep learning. We must keep learning so that we can say things that are worth listening to. Our children will know if what we're saying is not worth listening to. We must keep learning because sometimes the answer to our children's question will be, "I don't know. That's a good question. I think I know somebody who might know the answer." Let's see if we can find it together. We must keep learning because the archaeological record keeps growing and providing additional context and new layers of meaning for Scripture. We must keep learning so that when they are our age, our children will keep learning. We must keep learning so that we can follow the example of Christ in asking questions which do not merely inquire, but also reveal understanding. Knowledge is no substitute for faith. No comprehension of anything in this world can give us the relationship we have with God through Christ's grace, but also Christ says, "Behold, I am making all things new," and a willingness to learn more about God, about others, and about all the beauty and discomfort of the world around us is part of opening ourselves up to Christ's transformative love. And before I conclude, I'm going to insert a shameless plug for Pastor Tyler's Basic Lay Servants course. I'm convinced that at some point in their faith journey, every Methodist should take that basic course. It is designed to help you see your work as service in relationship with the ways that everyone else is serving in the church. And it is helpful to discern the areas of ministry for which you are best suited and put you on the road to being even better suited for them. Personally, I also think everyone should also take at least one other course that's offered by the School for Lay Ministry in their area of ministry. But start with the basic course. And if you can't make it the weekend Pastor Tyler's teaching it, SLM is offering it on Zoom a couple weeks before that. There are options. And if after prayerful consideration, it's not time yet for you to take the basic course, though I think for most of you it might be. I've got some suggestions. You can talk to me. I can hook you up with some podcasts and YouTube channels and stuff that can help you grow and help you keep learning. But however you keep learning, however you serve and love, however you proclaim the good news of your experience and relationship with God through Christ, keep the promise made in the baptismal covenant. Because remember, when someone is baptized or confirmed or affirmed in their faith or reaffirmed in their faith or joins the church, The church promises. Pray for our young people, those who are young in age and those who are young in faith, that they may be true disciples who walk in the way that leads to life. When you talk to the Lord, give thanks for the youth who are servant leaders of the church today. Ask for the blessing of guidance for those who mentor them and those who serve alongside them, and ask whether you are one of those. Because we are all servants together, all ages, nations, and races. We're all the Lord's children. We are all the church today.